Ernie, it's really something. I look back at various performers that I've discovered later in life, and I think, where was I? One of them was Ronnie James Dio,
Yep.
another Eva Cassidy, and
Hmm.
you introduced me to a singer when I first heard him, just absolutely blown away, and that is Kenny Rankin.
Yeah. Um, Kenny was amazing. I knew him for a long time at a lot of different places in both our lives. You can see by this picture behind me over here, we were like brothers, and it's really funny because he was one of the only music acts that was on Little David Records, which was basically a comedy label. It was Flip Wilson and George Carlin. Those were the guys that started in Monty Kaye, who was married to Diane Carroll and producing Diane Carroll. And Monty and Flip decided to start a comedy label. And they had a producer named Jack Lewis, One-Eyed Jack. He was crazy. And they signed George Carlin. And, George was just really going from Sam Sleet, the hippy-dippy weatherman, to being more like Lenny Bruce. He was really influenced a lot by Godfrey Cambridge, Lenny Bruce, a lot of comics that came before him because he really was the offspring of Milton Berle and those kinds of comics, that really that were kind of the comics of the 50s. And George started out there, but then the 60s came along and everything changed in his life. And he signed to Little David Records. And it's funny because even though Kenny and I became so close, we were first called in to Little David in 1974 for the comedy stuff. They had started this comedy label. They were a real big fan of the Cheech and Chong album we did for Big Bamboo, and they really thought that was something. And they reached out to us for a Burns and Schreiber. I don't know whether you remember. I'm sure you remember Burns and Schreiber. As a teenager, I loved them. They were on the Ed Sullivan Show, and they did the taxi cab bit, where Avery was the driver and Jack Burns was the passenger in the cab, and they'd go back and forth, and that became very, very big for them. And obviously, they were on Ed Sullivan quite a bit, and so I'm again like in the rock and roll business. We were talking where I'm a fan, and then I become working with them. The same thing happened here in comedy. I was a huge fan as a teenager of Jack Burns and Avery Schreiber and the taxi cab bit. We used to, talk about it in school and stuff. It was really funny. So we were called in because they were working on something that was very unique. It was as unique as Jesus Christ Superstar was to the rock opera and music business. They had a little album called The Watergate Comedy Hour. And it was all based on what was going on with President Nixon and Watergate and all that stuff. And they did this shtick. And they created an album, and they called us in to do the album cover. And Drew did this beautiful illustration. And I didn't put those up yet because I'm hoping, Joyce, at some time on the block, we can talk about comedy because it's something that we need desperately these days.
Yes.
And if I can talk about something that maybe one of our neighbors on the block wasn't aware of, just like you weren't aware of Kenny Rankin that well. And once you heard his music, you remember stuff that he did because you never really knew who did it, and so, I hope that at one point we can do maybe a show or two on comedy because I've done a lot of comedy. Everybody from Albert Brooks to Cheech and Chong to George Carlin, to Franklin and Jay, but at this point we're called in to really talk about the comedy album Burns and Schreiber was creating. And we were able to, I was there while they were writing and rehearsing. It was great. They had a big conference room at Little David Records up on Sunset. And I would go there and hang out with them and listen to them interact with the other players, doing a rehearsal in the conference room at Little David Records. And it was just awesome. And there I was, a huge fan of theirs. And I was in, just like being a huge fan of Jefferson Airplane and being in a recording studio with them, I'm at a table where they're rehearsing this album that became a really big album, so working with them. And then, as we did that, that was probably around 1973 when it was at its height with the Watergate thing and stuff. But that album became the pebble that started the avalanche at Little David Records. We then became, they were small. They didn't have an art department like most record companies, because that's who we were really competing against, because there were maybe 2 or 3 companies like ours. So the major record companies all had album cover design pieces to their facility, and we were constantly in competition, and they would always get the artist. They would have the artist's ear first because they were the label. So when the record, whether it was a comedian or group, they're there meeting with the AR guy or the PR guy or whatever, they walk them through the art department and pitch doing, yep. So we had, and thank God there were enough of them that just were, guys like Lee Dorman that exposed it later on, but people that really wanted that individual touch, that thing that made their record different than anybody else in their industry, comedy. Okay. And again, I think that's one of the reasons why Cheech and Chong, Big Bamboo we did became so well for us, because just, I guess every comedy act that we worked with always talked about that album. It's the same with Alice Cooper and Black Sabbath. People talk about those covers, and that's why they reach out to us. But, working with Little David was really amazing, because Burns and Schreiber was just one act. They had George Carlin, which was their lead horse. They had the Committee, which a lot of people don't remember because they were early on. They were early 60s, and they did a lot of controversial political stuff. And we did The Wide, Wide World of War, which is a great album cover. I did this huge collage, and then we needed a border that went around this collage. And so we dug a trench. We took the measurements and dug a trench in my backyard and filled it with bullets and knives and weapons and hand grenades. We went to Ellis Mercantile and rented all that stuff. You can rent that stuff. So we filled this trench with this border that goes around this collage that I did, and we photographed it. Again, I hope at some point we can do something. The Committee was really, they were great to work with. And then we had, we had Flip Wilson, who we didn't do an album for, but we did work on a book. And the book never got published because Little David ended. But toward the end, we were working on a book for Flip called The Devil Made Me Do It. And it was great. We had all these pictures, and Flip would write this clever lines to them, old pictures from the movies and stuff, and stories and illustrations. And I still have the comp, but it never went further than that, the comp, because the problems at Little David happened, and it was like that's a whole nother story. But, again, working with them was pretty amazing. And then all of a sudden, Monty had a big house up in Hollywood Hills, and he would have parties. And at this point, after these albums that we had done, these comedy albums, because all of them came before the music, we were called in for the comedy. Then we went to this big party at Monty's house with the Little David family. And it was all the acts. It was Milt and all the guys from Modern Jazz Quartet. It was all their acts. And Kenny Rankin was there. And I remember the first time I saw Kenny. And he was there with Yvonne and his 3 kids. And it sounds kind of stupid and hokey, but I love Kenny. I love Kenny like a brother. And I'll never forget that night. We were at the party, and he's in one end of the room, and I'm in the other. And there's all these other people that are talking and stuff. And it went like this, and our eyes met. And it was really, I never had that kind of an experience with someone. I didn't know who he was. He was just this good-looking guy who I had heard about. I had heard about Kenny Rankin, and there was no internet. I had to go to the record store, buy one of his, Like a Seed, a great album, and listen to it a little bit, because I wanted to do a little homework, because we knew we were going to be at this party, and now we're the agency. And now it's going beyond just the comedy. Now it's going to the music, okay? And Kenny and I met that night. We finally met each other and talked, and he was a big fan of Pacific Pioneer. And he started talking about this new album that he had coming out called Silver Morning, which you see up over here. I always get this screwed up. I should put, a little mark that directs me. But yeah, that album right there, Silver Morning. And the interesting thing about that album was when he gave us some tracks to listen to, and his voice is like an angel. Okay, and yeah, just amazing. And so Drew had joined us a year or so earlier, and he had never done a sculpture. So we talked about Silver Morning and how it should look, and he got this idea. He wanted to do a sculpture. He never did a sculpture before. So he got 3 pieces of wood about that thick, and he glued them together, and he started carving into them. And again, I'll send you some blow-ups that you'll be able to interject into this, but that album is pretty amazing. He did a 3-level woodcut and then colored it with colored pencils. Okay, the different things. And it's Kenny, his son Christopher, and their dog Kuma in this Art Nouveau kind of setting with trees and leaves, and it's just such a beautiful thing. And I had it for about a year. And Kenny, every time he would come to the office, because we had it up on it, he would want it. Okay. And the more we did stuff together, because they did a few albums for him, we became tighter and tighter. And he convinced me that I should at least lend it to him so he could put it on his mantle at his house. Right. So I did. And remember, this is the first Struzan sculpture ever. Okay. So that thing would be amazingly expensive today. So one day I'm over at Kenny's house and I don't see it up on the mantle. And I said, Kenny, what happened to the... Oh, well, Yvonne and I got in a fight and I grabbed it, smashed it into a million pieces. But that was Kenny. Kenny was like that. He was at a concert one night in Vegas, and it was packed, and he started singing, and people were talking, and he freaked out. He got really pissed off, walked off stage, and off in the wing that he walked off on was Liberace's piano. So he took his guitar and smashed it over Liberace's piano and brought me all the pieces from the guitar. And he had me do I put it all together in this sculpture kind of thing that looked like it was exploding. And he hung it over his fireplace where the Silver Morning piece used to be, but that was Kenny. Kenny was a beautiful, beautiful person that was troubled. He was troubled, and the guy was just an incredible musician. His songs, a lot of them, he did some pretty good Beatles covers. He did Blackbird, and then he also did he did Blackbird, and he did, there's one other one that he did. I can't remember. Anyway, it'll come to me. But he just really wrote. He was a writer himself. I mean, he wasn't just a singer. He actually played on a Bob Dylan album, Bringing It All Back Home. He was a guitar player on that album with Bob Dylan, and it just it was just amazing because his songwriting. I mean, he wrote "Peaceful" for Helen Reddy. He wrote "In the Name of Love" for Peggy Lee. He wrote "Haven't We Met" for Carmen McRae and Mel Torme. And when I was with him toward the end, Don Costa, who is the most prolific producer of music, he did all of Frank Sinatra's big hits. I mean, he loved Kenny. He loved Kenny Rankin. He predicted that Kenny Rankin was going to be the next Frank Sinatra. And he really could have, if Kenny would have been able to get around his demons, which was a hard thing for him to do. And after a couple of divorces, and I mean, I remember standing up for him. His second wedding was me, Pat O'Brien, the newscaster, Wojciechowicz from Barney Miller, and Kenny and George, all under this big tree at the reception, and we were all smoking to partying. You know, it was crazy. Kenny was crazy. But he was the most loving person. I mean, I remember one time that when Kenny and George were at the house, it was like 2 or 3 in the morning. Burton Cummings came over, and we're all sitting around, and Kenny's playing, and Burton and him are talking. We're drinking and partying, and at some point, and George is all over the place. And Bert, he turned to Kenny and he said, "You know what, Kenny?" Said, "I've been a fan of yours for a long time." And he goes, "You stink with class and elegance." And Kenny had just cracked. I mean, that was Burton Cummings. That's how Burton was, you know. I mean, and it was just, it was an amazing experience for me to been able to and meet Don Costa. It was right after he had a heart operation, and he lifted up his shirt and showed us his big ass scar all over his chest. He was a character, but he loved Kenny, and he produced that album, and it was really good. I mean, Kenny really was my best friend. And when he actually, when George passed, Kenny played at George's wake. And then when Kenny passed, it was really devastating for me, because at one point we were like the Three Musketeers. We really were for several years. I mean, we pretty much worked with Little David Records up until about 1976, I think, when they had broken up, and Franklin and Jay, Don't Smoke, Don't Fry Your Hair, that album was the first, or was the last album that we did for Little David. And then Franklin went on to become more of a movie star. He was in Roots, and he was Chicken George in Roots, and you know, really a great guy. And I remember when we did that album for him, we had a Tesla coil behind him. Okay, it was don't smoke, don't fry your hair. So we got this Tesla coil, this huge Tesla coil with like you see in the Frankenstein movies, and we put him in front of it, but the noise freaked him out, and we got some great. I got this whole photo shoot him with all these expressions on his face, you know, from this Tesla coil that was behind him, but it sounded like it was right there. You know, you could sit his hair up right there with smoke. I mean, Franklin was a lot of fun to work with, a very creative guy, and you know, I just miss them both all the time. I've been close with a lot of friends and a lot of musicians and artists that we work with, but never any closer than Kenny. And Burton and Kenny are the two that were really closest to me. And thank God Burton's still well and he's touring with Randy. But, you know, when Kenny passed, Kenny gave me this beautiful clock. It was an Art Deco clock, and I think I may have mentioned it to you. It was from the 40s. It has a chef on it with some cool lettering. And he gave it to me, and this is the honest to God truth, makes the hair stand up on my arm. The day he passed away, that clock stopped working. I still have it in my studio. It's still set at 4 o'clock on that day. And it was just like Kenny saying goodbye. You know, it was weird. I mean, I never experienced anything like that. And it was kind of scary too, you know. But
it's a true spiritual message.
Yeah,
there's
it
many
is.
books written about that.
Yeah, I believe it. And it's a lot of the times it's through electricity, electrical things that allow that to happen, you know, and you know, that was just so weird. The day he passed away, I heard that he passed away, and I was out it was hanging in the dining room where I worked in that old house, and it had stopped, and I couldn't get it to work again. I plugged it in, you know, it wasn't the socket, it wasn't the plug in, it just stopped working. And it's set right at 4 o'clock. You know, I don't know whether that's the hour he passed away, but it was really sad because he had just completed a new album, had written a new album, and was getting ready to go in and record it. And I think Don was going to produce it, and he got diagnosed with throat cancer. A couple of weeks later, passed away.
It's very sad. You know, yeah. Don Costa had just had an ear for talent.
Yeah, he did. He really did. And for him, like I said, I mean, I was there. I only was there at Don's house once with Kenny, but you could see the love. You could see the love and the respect that Don had for Kenny and Kenny's abilities. You know, they were really. I think if Kenny wouldn't have passed away, he would have been a much bigger star. You know, it was like sometimes it takes longer than others. You know, a guy like Bob Seger, you know, around for 25 years, all of a sudden he gets a big hit and there he goes. You know what I mean? But it's never giving up. Never give up. Kenny never gave up. He never gave up. He was just that kind of person. And, you know, the problem with the candle that burns twice as bright burns half as long. And that's, if I had to sum it up for Kenny, that's really, you know, that's what I would say about it. I mean, he was an amazing talent like no one else and gone, you know, but his albums are still out there. His songs are still there. And as long as we can talk about them, you know, he'll always live. He lives through his music, you know, and I've had many conversations. We were friends, really tight friends, like brothers for 4 or 5 years, maybe even longer. And then, you know, as life has it, they each go your different ways. The record industry kind of dried up for us in the 80s and we moved on. Luckily, we always had one foot in corporate. So the corporate thing saved us when other companies like us and other artists that were coming out of art school wanting to do album covers, that whole industry went into the dumper. You know, the industry took everything back from the artists and it just became really, I mean, there was good albums still done, album covers, but not like it was. We were in a real renaissance. That 14 years was a real renaissance that I refer to as the golden age of custom interactive album packaging. Long term, but still really true. You know, more than just pulling the record out, putting it on the player, looking at the liner notes, you know, pictures. So that was always our goal.
You know, Ernie, you said it, you know, like the albums, the recordings are around and the designs, you know, that are there that we can see. And it's people like myself and people in future generations, they're going to find out about Kenny. So I fully believe that an artist really never dies. Yeah. Thanks to the you know, thanks to the recordings and thanks to the art.
The producers and the record companies, as much as crooked as the record companies were, thank God for them because we wouldn't have any of it. You know, so in a way, it was like a blessing and a curse. You know, and Kenny always fought for the little guy, always fought for the underdog. You know, and I guess he felt that he was pretty much that person a lot. Even though he, you know, I told you, he and George toured to all those college campuses. That was one of the things that really got him started, you know, and getting recognition. He did Johnny Carson with George, but he also did these college campuses that people loved his music. A lot of times, unfortunately, they were there for George, you know, and he was just like the opening act, you know. So, but they were great friends. They really loved each other. And I was lucky and very blessed to be part of that. You know, and you see a couple of albums back here. There's After the Roses, which was great, and the Kenny Rankin album, and Silver Morning, of course. And, you know, and for songs, you know, this is a hard one, you know, but Blackbird is definitely was probably one of his biggest hits, which was the cover of the Beatles song. Silver Morning is amazing. So that would be my second one. And I've got a third one here because Kenny in Haven't We Met, the song that he wrote, he does some amazing scat singing. You know, Kenny was a master at scat. And that song is a really good representation of that and his ability to do it. And, you know, again, you know, I don't know which songs you pick, but if you could play one of those or all three, I think Kenny would look down and smile on you. You know, I know he's around, and I still feel him every time I go out to my office. I see that clock, and I think of him. You know, and again, you know, I'm really blessed to be able to hang out on the corner. You know, it's a great block you've got here. It's wonderful people, and I'm getting more and more response. 300 views on some of these shows that we've done. Over 300. I mean, that's amazing, Joyce, and God bless you for letting me be able to do it, and for the neighbors to put up with it. And I don't know whether you've noticed, but our show together gets longer and longer.
It's all right. That's quite all right. Because you know, it's amazing because since we started doing it, I keep finding out more and more and then just discovering all about Kenny. I would have never known about him. I knew him more through his songwriting, but I would have never known about his singing, and to be so blown away. And that I'm recommending to our jazz host, Dave May, Desert Island Jazz. And I said, check him out.
Oh, he would be great.
To hear
that's where he lived, you know. And, you know, he he was asked, I don't know if you know this, but he was asked by Paul McCartney to perform when he and John Lennon were inducted into the Songwriter Hall of Fame. Kenny Kenny was around, it just didn't get the kind of, and he'll blame himself, which is really where a lot of the blame begins, because he just had those demons that it's like taking 2 steps forward and sliding back 3. But he never stopped taking the steps forward, ever. Even on his deathbed, he had plans to do. I talked to his son, Christopher, who is a producer now. He produces music and stuff. And said even on his deathbed, he wanted to have those songs done, and hopefully eventually they'll do it. He's got 3 wonderful children, and, it's pretty amazing anyway. That's that. And hopefully we can do some comedy stuff down the road.
Would love to do it. That's the beauty of public radio. We can really reach out, and it's amazing because there's a lot of variety, and people, just ordinary people, will have different things in their collection, and comedy is believe it or not,
it's something we all have.
Yes.
It's something we need more now than ever, because that whole industry is changing. And, it's people like you that make them aware of it. I listen to your show every week, and the music selection is amazing, and it just flows, and you're really good because you've done your homework, stuff and things. So there's this educational piece of listening to your show that's really, hopefully that's what Ernie's Corner is about, getting these stories out there, because if I tell 2 people, they'll tell 2, and they'll tell 6, and exponentially it just gets bigger and bigger. And that's all I could hope for, and thank you for letting me do it.